We're going to have to start in that case. As you can see, the panelists were nattering away about the subject of this conversation, so I think we should actually make it a full room discussion. Welcome back to the first of our parallel sessions. Really delighted to be discussing the Labour Party's plans for power on the UK and Europe. We have, I'm delighted to say, a very old friend of the Fabian Society, Hilary Benn, who was, get a bit of more of a woo. Thank you. When one person goes, we should all join. Hilary obviously has played some critical roles in the Labour Party, in opposition and government, in good times and bad, and it is fantastic to see him back on the front bench as Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, where that brief obviously has a totally critical role to play in our future relationships with the EU, but thinking about peace and prosperity in Northern Ireland as well. Then we'll be hearing some responses to Hilary. So we'll be hearing from Anand Menon, who is the Director of the UK in A Changing Europe, and from Anya Sripcek, who is the Director of Research and Training at our partner think tank, FEPS, who will be so pleased to be organising this event with jointly today. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion. So let us begin with Hilary. Would you like to use the lectern and make your speech?
Well, Andrew, thank you very much indeed. When I came in, like all of you, I was given one of these, and I said, "What's that for?" And they said, "It shows your security cleared." But nobody looked in my bag to find my speech. So anyway, here we go. Happy New Year. Thanks very much for your kind invitation. I'm going to talk about Northern Ireland and about the European Union, because Northern Ireland is a really good place to start to help us understand some of the challenges of negotiating a new relationship with Europe. Now, one of my new resolutions, to be honest, the only new resolution I have, is the hope that the executive in the Assembly in Northern Ireland will get back up and running. Because 25 years after the historic Belfast Good Friday Agreement, Labour's crowning achievement, I have to say, the people of Northern Ireland need a functioning government back. A government that's going to tackle the many problems that communities and public services currently face. Huge strike in Northern Ireland on Thursday, because you've got public sector workers. Some of them haven't had a pay rise for 3 years. But also to make the most of the great opportunities that there are in Northern Ireland, including ready access to both the UK, well, the GB, and the EU market, which can help the economy to grow and to create jobs. Now, how did Northern Ireland get this significant opportunity? Well, of course, ironically, it's a consequence of Brexit. One of the consequences was a decision had to be made about what do we do about trade across the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, which everyone agreed about. The only thing that everyone agreed on was that border must remain open on the one hand, and on the other hand, the EU's wholly legitimate desire and insistence to ensure that any goods crossing that border comply with the rules of the single market. So there were always going to be checks somewhere, and that's the truth. Now, the result was the Windsor Framework, which, along with the protocol, is the cause of the DUP's current absence from government. I hope very much that they will return to government. I think they should return to government, not least because the framework is here to stay. Whoever is in government in Westminster in a year's time, and anyone who thinks otherwise has got it wrong. Now, there is money on the table in Northern Ireland. I think it provides a basis on which to go forward. And after months of negotiations between the government and the DUP, now is the time to get this done and restore the institutions, because the alternatives really do not bear contemplation. On the one hand, facing the prospect of there being no return at all to self-government, to devolve government in Northern Ireland on the one hand, or the idea that somehow full direct rule is going to be restored. And surely politicians from all parties, representing all communities in Northern Ireland, can come together to establish the Assembly, which was, after all, chosen by the people of Northern Ireland in a democratic election only 20 months ago. It hasn't met. Can you think of any other country in the world where Parliament gets elected and it doesn't meet? To come together and to create an executive which can get on with the task of government. This is, after all, the responsibility we take on when we stand for office. I put it like this: we deal with the world as it is as we seek to change it into the world we would wish it to be. So, what are the prospects for a new relationship with Europe if we do win the election? Well, Kieran David, as you will know, have talked about seeking to negotiate new agreements, including a veterinary and phytosanitary agreement, better access for professionals providing services in EU markets, mutual recognition of professional qualifications, improved scientific collaboration, an EU waiver scheme for UK touring artists and musicians, and a reduction in other administrative burdens and barriers for business. Now let's take the example of an SPS veterinary agreement, the aim of which would be to smooth trade across the Irish Sea, but also across the Channel. Now, that won't be straightforward, you've got to be honest, and it could take quite some time. And my good friend Anand has correctly pointed out what is in it for the EU, and that is a question that we have to take very seriously. But one thing is very clear: if the Windsor Framework were not to be implemented, there would be no SPS agreement or any other agreement. Why? Because if the UK were once again to renege on an international agreement it has signed, which is what Boris Johnson and Liz Truss did, then that would destroy trust with the EU. The UK cannot be a country that signs its name on an international agreement and then goes and does the opposite. That is ruinous for our international reputation around the world. And I say that as someone who argued that the original implementation of the protocol wouldn't work in Northern Ireland, including for reasons, in fairness, that many in the unionist community pointed out. Now, I genuinely believe that the Windsor Framework represents a significant step forward. Why? Because Maros Sefcovic, to his great credit, understood there was a problem and changed the EU's approach. Detailed implementation, of course, has to be worked through. That's another reason why there needs to be an executive in Northern Ireland. But most businesses I've met since taking up the post have told me, well, the Green Lane's working reasonably well. And the negotiation of the framework demonstrated that it is possible to persuade the EU to show flexibility, just as they did when they acted to ensure that NHS medicines could continue to be available to NHS patients in Northern Ireland. They changed EU law to make that happen. Now, there will, of course, be trade-offs. And the EU, I think in all probability, will say on an SPS veterinary agreement, well, sure, on the basis of what is known as dynamic alignment in the trade, a terrible phrase. What it means is that every time the EU changes its standards, the country with whom it is seeking an agreement says, yeah, okay, we'll change our standards straight away. And if there's an argument, the ECJ will oversee it and reach a decision. And yet, the EU does have a veterinary equivalence agreement with New Zealand that doesn't involve either of those things. Discuss. So, there'll be plenty to talk about. And the question is, will the EU be willing to contemplate it? And that's what the point, Anand, that you have made. And here I think we have to be really frank. Brexit has, of course, affected politics in the UK, but it's also affected politics in the European Union. The EU is a bit tired of negotiating with Britain. They've got lots of other things on their plate. And we have to recognise that while the EU has loads of experience of negotiating agreements with countries coming towards it, never before has it had to do a deal, the TCA in this case, or contemplate anything further with a big country that's walked out. Now, I am a great believer in the healing qualities of time. And there is no doubt that the arrival of a Labour government, if we win people's trust and confidence, will be greeted in the EU with a big and audible sigh of relief. And I think eventually there is going to be a moment when we look at each other across the channel and say, you know what, we're still big and important trading partners, we're still friends and allies, we are cooperating on foreign policy and security, and we need to do more of that. That's one of the deals that Kieran David said we are going to seek. So wouldn't it make sense to have a closer relationship? And why does this matter so much? Well, clearly it matters economically, but there's something else that is even more important, and that is building alliances in a dangerous world. Let's just look around us. Here we are, January 2024. War in Ukraine, created by Russia's invasion. The Middle East in flames. A civil war in Sudan, which not a lot of people talk about, but lots of people are being killed. Tensions with China over Taiwan, the threat of climate change, and the loss of biodiversity, which is the source of our very existence as humankind. We must never, ever forget that. The risk of another Trump presidency to the international rules-based system that we, with others, created out of the rubble and the ashes of the Second World War, including the European Convention on Human Rights, which some in politics in Britain are now arguing we should walk out of. An absolute disaster. And all of these are really powerful reasons why we should come together with those who share our common values to defend those values in the face of these threats. And the most important lesson of all for me is that the best way to protect your sovereignty, which was in some ways at the heart of the Brexit referendum debate, the best way to protect your sovereignty is to work with others. Thank you.
Hilary, thank you so much. In those few minutes, you covered so much ground of the critical focus on Northern Ireland, but also that hugely complex and broad landscape of issues that we will need to negotiate with the EU if Labour returns to power. It feels that there is a sort of an emerging plan for what Labour would want to do in its first year or two. I think there's much more of a question mark as to how that relationship would evolve over a full parliamentary term or even beyond. And it was really interesting hearing what Sadiq said earlier, and he was on almost every topic ultra loyal to the UK national leadership, except perhaps on where we go with our EU relationship. And he certainly said that he would like to see a conversation and debate about closer integration back into the single market or customs union, which is something that the front bench has been very clear about ruling out. So there's clearly a lot to talk about in terms of that medium to long term sort of where the relationship goes, even if we're pretty clear what we want over the first year or two. And Hilary, you talked about some of those critical issues like, what's Europe going to want from us rather than just what do we want on our negotiation list. And that issue of continuing divergence over time. If nothing changes, we might carry on diverging, but the EU will certainly from the current status quo. And what does that mean in terms of our long-term relationship? So much to get stuck into. So I'm now delighted to sort of bring in a UK perspective and then an EU perspective. So we'll start off with Anand, with your reflections.
Thanks very much. I hate going after Hilary because he's so bloody reasonable and I tend to agree with him. So I'm going to try and do my best to manufacture some minor differences with him so we can at least have a conversation about this. It strikes me that our relationship with the European Union going forward is going to be a series of political and economic landmines that we're going to have to try and negotiate our way around in several ways. Firstly, obviously I agree with everything that Hilary said about Northern Ireland, but I think it's just worth reflecting for the moment that the consent vote is, and this is a high bar, probably among the most toxic legacies that Boris Johnson will leave us, because it guarantees that every 4 years the sectarian divide comes back to the fore in Northern Irish politics at a very moment when actually that's the worst possible thing for Northern Ireland. I'll say in parentheses that I think in 20 years' time, if you write a book on political failures, the DUP and the One Nation Conservatives will be chapters 1 to 10, because I don't think this is going to serve them politically at all, but this seems to be the position they've dug themselves into. On SPS, it's interesting, and the landmines are plentiful here. The first landmine is this: we don't have the checks in place with the European Union that we're meant to have at the moment. They're meant to come in on the 31st of January. I'd bet someone else's mortgage that they won't. Because given that the Chancellor last November, the last time they delayed putting them in place, said they will lead to inflationary pressures, which is quite an admission if you think about it from a Tory Chancellor, there is very little reason to suspect they'll want to run the risk of inflation going up again by bringing them at the end of Jan. The problem Labour will have is as long as those checks aren't in place, the EU have nothing to negotiate, because we have nothing to give them. So the first thing a Labour government is going to have to do is put in place checks that will lead to food price inflation and potentially lead to some food shortages in our supermarket, which isn't a great political look, but actually is a bit of a bear trap that the Conservatives will have left for us. It's also worth bearing in mind that for all the good an SPS agreement would do, and Hillary laid out the case for, its overall macroeconomic effect will be trivial. So, pick a number in terms of the impact of Brexit on our economy. It will be significant, and it is forever. But an SPS agreement with the European Union will make very, very little difference to it. And the final point on New Zealand, yes, New Zealand have got a rather good deal, but that's because they're bloody miles away. And relative to us, there's very little happens over the border. So it's a lot easier to negotiate a really good deal with New Zealand about animal products, and far more difficult for all the reasons you can tell quite easily if you look at a map, why the EU would necessarily be so kind to us. And of course, Sadiq's right in the sense that the ultimate economic benefit of a closer relationship with the European Union will come from single market membership. That's where the majority of the economic hit to our economy comes from. But actually here, I've got to caution that whilst that will be economically beneficial, I cannot help but think it would be a political nightmare, and I fully understand why the leadership are very, very sceptical about it. We believe in democracy, and there is an issue with EEA membership when it comes to democracy, because you do become a rule taker, not in a very, very simplistic way. There's all sorts of committees and things like that, but at the end of the day, we would be accepting onto our statute books laws over which we have no vote. And I, for one, have my suspicions about that on a matter of principle, and also pragmatically, the notion that, a French government would have more say over the regulations governing the City of London than we would strikes me as slightly suboptimal, whatever scenario you imagine for France's future. The one area where I think there is real possibility for progress is on security, and David Lammy has spoken about this. Not necessarily because we can really improve security cooperation per se. Actually, if you think about what's happened with Ukraine, the way we've worked with the European Union has been pretty impressive, and it's hard to see how you could build on that. But one of the curiosities of our relationship with the European Union is that there is no formalized mechanism for our politicians to meet with theirs. China has an agreement with the European Union that guarantees a heads of summit meeting every year. We have nothing. Nothing at all in the trade and cooperation agreement that means that our political leaders have to sit round a table together. And in a time of global instability, as Hillary so clearly laid out, that, I think, is very, very important indeed. And that is one area where I hope we will see some movement under a future Labour government. I've gone on for too long. I'll stop.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anand. And thank you for that reminder that whatever the 2019 election said, Brexit is not done. There is still implementation underway, and whether it will actually happen is a major headache for 2024. Anya, so really want to bring in your perspective as, for this meeting's perspective, you are the European Union. The critical point that has been raised here about, sort of, what's in it for the EU? Aren't you all just sick of the Brits? And do you want to even have this conversation?
Fantastic, thank you so much. This is a question with no pressure for an answer, right, when it comes to political correctness. I would like to start by thanking you for having an opportunity for this conversation, because this morning we were asked how many times we have been at this type of an event, and I've just realized that we have been partnering for 15 years through thin and thick, and this is amazing that together we've managed to keep the conversation going through very turbulent times when we were together in the European Union and discussing its future, through the points where we were breaking out, and now when we are discussing how we can lay out the relations together. I have only 2.5 minutes left, and I can't speak as quickly as I would love to, so I'm just going to touch upon 3 different points in response to what the speakers before me had just said. I want to talk about the narrative, I want to talk about Northern Ireland, and I want to talk about the neighbourhood. Those would be the 3 points I would like to touch. When it comes to the narrative, I think that together through the conversations we've been having, this room would have never been like this 15 years ago. I think it was a niche conversation, usually coming about what's wrong with the European Union. And I think we've done together a study with Fabian Society when we looked at the issues where people were dissatisfied with the relations between the EU and the UK when the UK was a member of the European Union. And it came down very much to the promise that the European Union was supposed to offer prosperity, democracy, welfare, security. Right? And I think that now the narrative is changing, and we have an incredible window of opportunity to define those relationships along everything that we've been told and we've learned in the past years, and make it better, looking at the opportunities that we have if we want to jointly connect in shaping the progress. I think that was the expression this morning. We have green transition, we have demographic changes, we have the issue of digital transition, and we are also going into the elections. I mean, I know that in the UK, it's mostly the UK and London elections that exist this year, but actually almost half of the world's population is going to the elections, including the European Union. So I think we are very timely in shaping the discussion what sort of policy we want to run together, hoping that progressives, at least in Europe, will be one of the leading forces. We don't like saying the second one. The second issue is the question of the Northern Ireland. I mean, you asked me, Andy, if the conversation about the UK is not becoming a niche conversation for the interested club when it comes to Brussels, right? And I think there has been a period where indeed there was a certain fatigue about, the deadlocks in the different conversations. But this year, actually last year, we've started a project about Northern Ireland and the prospects of Northern Ireland and the responsibility of the European Union when it comes to upholding peace in Northern Ireland. Yeah, exactly. We went to Belfast, and that was my first time. Now, I consider myself a little bit of an Anglophile. I've been to every Labour Party conference since 2004, so I can't really complain about the lack of British experience. I don't know what I had been expecting, but what I had seen was totally different to whatever I could have been prepared from whatever literature I could have got my holds on. I was in the room with people saying, please find a solution. It's fine if it's in 5 years or in 10 years, but as long as the solution is the lasting one. I usually enter the rooms where people tell me, can we have a solution yesterday or tomorrow? This 5 years kind of a feeling was this sort of, please do it and please do it well, and I think the organization like mine bears the responsibility of keeping this conversation going, because we do have a responsibility for the peace process, and the European Union has been instrumental in that, and we have to continue doing that, not treating that as a niche issue, but as an issue that defines what we want to have as a conversation about the future of the European Union. And that's my last point. Currently, the European Union is starting sort of new set of presidencies where we will be discussing the future of the EU. I think the war on our continent, the war in the Middle East, I mean, those all issues have been mentioned, the different predicaments that we are facing. Those are the issues we need to discuss, but we also need to discuss what sort of a European Union we want. Do we want that to be more of a defense union? Do we want to complete the reform of the market? What sort of people's social union we want to have to make sure that equality, cohesion, prosperity, opportunities for young people, for anyone really, are given by this union. And I think in this conversation about how big the union should be, we should have a space for a conversation what sort of a relationship with the UK will be in a fundamental manner. We've had a sort of collection of groundbreaking speeches about the future of the EU. We've had the ideas like the European Political Union, but then again, the European political community as such is a meeting. It's not a format that decides things. And I do think that if we've learned something from Brexit, and if we've learned something about the cry out about more democracy in politics that we are facing currently now, we need to ensure that this conversation is going to be politically legitimate, transparent, and also understandable for the people, because this is something that will be shaping the future on the continent that we share, and in the world per extension, and the world is changing very rapidly. Thank you so much. I've done, I think, 5 minutes instead of 3. I hope for your forgiveness. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you very much, Anya. Hilary, could I ask you a couple of questions? Picking up on what Anand said about all the proposals Labour currently has for reintegration are not going to move the dial when it comes to what we've already lost in terms of leaving the EU. Rachel has been very clear that fastest growth in the G7 is the first Labour mission. What happens if in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, a Labour government just is looking at our growth, is seeing that it's not good enough, and knows that there are ways we could reintegrate and grow faster? What do you do next? What do you do after that first year or 18 months?
Well, my first response to that perfectly fair question, Andrew, is let's get a Labour government first. Secondly, the question you put is what Churchill described as the problems of success. Now, let's be honest with each other. I support what Keir said when he laid out very clearly early on in his leadership, we're not rejoining the EU single market and the customs union. Because I think that was practically and politically exactly the right approach to take. Why? In part because, well, the then Prime Minister, I know they change so frequently, but the last, not the last one, but the one before, he wanted to fight the next election on a rerun of 2019. And by closing that off, and the other point I would make is, if you were to do any of those things, you would require another referendum. And I meet almost nobody who says, yeah, Labour should go into the next election promising a referendum on our relationship with Europe. Nobody. Well, there may be 1 or 2 people in the audience, or people get round it by saying, oh, you don't need a referendum to do that. Well, I'm afraid I disagree with that profoundly. So, what it has done is to open up the space to talk about the things that we've been touching on already today. And if you go through that list that Labour has set out, and if we were to make progress on all of those, then, I mean, we've got a trade and cooperation agreement at the moment, which doesn't involve tariffs, thank goodness, which is why a no-deal Brexit would have been, an absolute disaster. You're beginning to look like a kind of association agreement. And the EU has huge experience of negotiating association agreements. That's the second answer I give. And the third is really to draw on the point that you made. What is the EU going to look like in the years ahead? Because the point about flexibility and change applies to them as it does to us. At the start of the implementation of the protocol, the EU said, right, that's where you've chosen to put your third country border. Here's the rule book. Off you go. The rule book said, you may not be aware of this, but every night a lot of lorries go from Cairnryan to Larne or to Belfast containing the products that they promise to get to the stores by 3 a.m, so the shelves are full by 8:30 or 9 when they open. The EU starting position was that every single one of those items, including a box of cornflakes, had to have an export health certificate to be sold only in stores in Northern Ireland because a number of the main supermarkets don't have stores in the Republic. Now, they cost, 70, 80, 90, 100 pounds each. Lorry, 2,500 items. We've now ended up, because of the Windsor Framework, with one document relating to the same lorry and all the items. Now, at the start, people would have said, not possible. EU rules, that's it, can't change. And that's why I was so keen, as I've done previously, to pay credit to Maros Sefcovic, because you put it superbly. The EU realised this wasn't actually about economics. The EU must continue to protect the integrity of its single market. And, animal products, pests and diseases coming across the border is a big, big problem. A box of cornflakes being eaten in Donegal because someone went to Derry to do their weekly shop is not going to bring the single market crashing down around its ears, is it? No, it isn't. So, and the final point I'd make in answering your question, Andrew, is this. When he was first elected, President Macron made this really important speech at the Sorbonne about a Europe of concentric circles. And I must confess I've always been a fan of that, because if you think of Britain's membership, we were in the outer inner circle. We didn't join the euro quite properly, in my view. We weren't in Schengen. And who knows what the EU may look like, not so much in 3 years' time, but 5, 10, 15 years' time. So, you know what? One step at a time is my answer to your question.
Anna, can I ask you, one thing we haven't mentioned so far is public opinion. Where do you think, obviously there's a lot of support, but probably quite flaky support for, you know, at least not doing what we have just done. Some people would like to reverse the decision. How's that going to change over the next few years, do you think? You know, is this contingent on sort of hostility to the Tory government rather than a sort of a deep, you know, sort of sense that everything that's happened since 2016 was wrong?
Well, I mean, public opinion has changed, first and foremost. It's changed largely because of, let me politely call it, demographic churn, by which I mean loads of people who voted Leave in 2016 have died, and loads of young people who weren't eligible to vote in 2016 have entered the electorate. But best estimate is about 16-17% of Leave voters now say they'd vote Remain. So there's been some changing of mind, but it's not massive. So public opinion has shifted. There's majority support for rejoin. The most striking thing about public opinion for me is how little people care. I mean, if you go back to 2019, you know, the meaningful votes, Ipsos, when it was doing its salience tracker, had over 70% of people saying relations with the European Union were the most important issue facing the UK. That number is about 6 now. And in all the work we've done recently, the one thing actually that unites Leave and Remain supporters is they all want us to talk about something else. So I think, yeah, public opinion might have shifted, but I think that salience level is really, really important. It's a brave politician indeed who decides to spend 10 years negotiating something that only 6% of the population care about, I have to say.
Right, let's get some questions from the room. I think there's a mic somewhere. Yes, brilliant. So I'll take batches of 3. Let's start. We'll start front with that man here. Oh, it's a mic with a wire. So if delegates could pass it on, see how we get on. I hadn't seen that. Yes, go and just say who you are.
Thanks
and very
very much.
short questions, please.
Hi, it is Alexander. I want to widen the question, really, saying Europe has a lot of diversity in terms of its democracies. It's got proportional representation, a lot more elected representatives, a lot more democratic innovations. What can Labour learn from, or can Labour learn, and what should it learn? And what's the scope for cooperation between sub-UK levels of government with Europe and deepening relations between councils and the role of the
Thank you.
Council of Europe? Thank you.
Great. Another question? I'll go for, the man there.
Someone's going to get tied in knots.
Yeah.
Very well.
Sorry, right, near the door, pink shirt.
My name is Eamon O'Tierney. I'm a member of the Labour Party Irish Society. And I'd like to ask Hillary, when he says that there must be devolved institutions up and running in the north of Ireland, if in 10 months' time he is the Northern Ireland Secretary, what would he do and what levers would he pull to make sure that that happens?
Great, thank you. Another question? Yeah, we'll go for... I was about to say the person with a red armband, which means everyone in the room. The woman with dark hair and a red armband. Yes, there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Anna Abel. I'm a director at Flint Global. My background is in Brussels diplomacy. I'd like to ask a question that the panel has alluded to but hasn't fully answered. So the next European Commission's in-tray is extremely full. They've got, a war on their doorstep, the prospect of enlargement, and the major challenge of declining European competitiveness. So what is the incentive for the European Union to enter into what seems like a very broad-ranging negotiation with the United Kingdom? Have we thought about what some of their incentives could be?
Anya, could I start with you on that question?
Certainly. What's the incentive? I think what's the alternative? We have to be very pragmatic in that sense. I mean, idealistic part is, of course, talking about the part of the values and the shared ambition for the progress and prosperity for all, on one hand. On the other hand, of course, the issue of enlargement redefines the European community, but it also means that it redefines its relation, its capacity to create what we have been promising, European strategic autonomy. And I do not think that currently all the global challenges and the different world problems when it comes to keeping the sort of ambition for the multipolar world can be acquired otherwise than through the conversation with the United Kingdom. So, and I am a little bit more hopeful. I mean, I know that we are reading the same polls and there has been a discussion about, you know, rise of the right-wing extreme and so on. But when we're looking at the composition of the next European Parliament, the progressive forces are still going to be substantial. They are going to be still substantially representative. And I'm hoping that the ongoing conversation between the progressives in the UK and the EU will be yet another political incentive, because I think the panel has been discussing that one thing is the rule, but the other thing is also political will. And this is something we need to keep on ensuring having.
Great. Anna, there was a question about sort of democracy and devolution.
Yeah, I mean, the obvious lesson we have to learn from some of our European partners is about how effectively you can promote growth in second cities via devolution. I mean, economically, the one obvious sort of glaring weakness our economy has is, whilst London is a powerhouse, our second cities are very, very weak in terms of productivity compared to their equivalents in the European Union. Part of that is down to devolution. I should also say that because we're such a services-based economy, it simply won't be as easy as for, say, Germany to have manufacturing hubs around the country because of the pressures of agglomeration when it comes to services. I mean, that's one of the reasons London is such a powerhouse, is because of our emphasis on services. But I think devolution is the one key takeaway I'd take from some of our European partners as a passport to greater economic growth.
And Anne did a brilliant job supporting the Fabian's Commission on Regional Inequality and Poverty, which made a big call on greater devolution that really filtered down into sort of bread and butter living standards issues. Hilary, you can pick up all of those, but there's a particular question about the Irish settlement.
Sure. Well, look, it's a very fair question. I hope very much it doesn't come to that, because I hope that devolved government will have been restored. The fundamental problem is this. The structure of power sharing that was created by the Good Friday Agreement and implemented by the 1998 Act is what made it possible for representatives of the two main communities. There is the other category, because when you go in, you say, I'm either unionist, nationalist, or other. So it's a very structured system. That is what made joint government possible. Now, I don't think anyone intended at the time that that structure would also be the means by which the whole caboodle could be pulled down. And that is the problem that we have got. How do you maintain consent for power sharing, but how do you at the same time ensure that an executive and assembly continue to function? And I think the straight answer to your question is, this is a conversation that we need to be have by whoever is the Secretary of State with the parties themselves. The position of some of the parties is you can't talk about that unless the executive is up and running, but if it doesn't look like the executive is going to be up and running, then I think there will need to be discussions about what do we do about this together. Because Northern Ireland cannot be the only part of the United Kingdom where elected politicians are incapable. And do not forget, Sinn Féin collapsed the institutions for 3 years. 3 years. And the DUP said to them at the time, get back into government. And then the DUP has collapsed the institutions for 2 years, and Sinn Féin says to the DUP, get back into government. In the end, it's everybody's responsibility to ensure, having been elected, they get on and do their job, because the frustration on the part of a majority of people in Northern Ireland at the absence of a government is really quite terrible. I did like your answer on what's the incentive, what's the alternative. I think that's a really good point. The question that Anand referred to namely the fact that we haven't, as the UK, yet implemented full checks coming from Calais to Dover. When you think about it, it's quite extraordinary in one sense. Brexit has imposed on British businesses the full cost, bureaucracy and paperwork of Brexit. And the first year that came in, HMRC produced some really interesting figures that showed that the total number of businesses in Britain that were exporting goods to the EU after the first year fell by 1/3, which is astonishing. But why did that happen? They were mainly small businesses, they had small margins, they might have been selling, bicycle seats to a cycling shop in Amsterdam, and they said, it's not worth it for all of this. EU businesses have not yet experienced the full embrace of cost, bureaucracy and paperwork. Now, it's an interesting dilemma, and Anand, you put your finger on it. If that were to come in, there'd be a lot of European businesses saying to the EU, what the hell is this? Can't we make trade easier between us? And that is the question that both of us have got to address.
Yeah. Henry, Anna used a really resonant phrase, European strategic autonomy. And how much do you think what happens in America with the possible re-election of Trump might influence our relationship with the rest of Europe?
Well, this is a really important point and a desperately troubling one. I mean, the first thing I would say is when Russia invaded Ukraine, the EU was very surprised that the Tory government didn't even ask for some arrangement to be in the room to meet, to talk about foreign policy or defence. They were fully expecting it. They would have been happy to agree to something. What's the first thing that happened? We all got in the same room and said, what the hell are we going to do about this? So you have seen in practice this cooperation between European countries in the EU, not in the EU, to support Ukraine in its hour of need. The second point I would make is, well, what is Donald Trump going to do if he wins the election? Now, he said, typical Trumpian style, I'll end the war in Ukraine in, I think he said the first day. Did he say the first day? Well, we can speculate as to what he means by that, but some people argue he would say to Ukraine, that's it. And what does that mean for Europe's wider security? Because the fight in Ukraine is about the security of Europe as well as the security of Ukraine. We also know what Donald Trump has said in the past and isn't saying now about American support for NATO. Now, the conclusion, it seems to me, that we as European countries need to draw from that is we're going to have to come together and work much more closely to ensure that that security of Europe, to which we are all committed, is maintained, even if the support we have relied on for so many years since the end of the Second World War, if it were to be less than we currently enjoy.
Let's have some more questions. Right, lots of hands. I don't know if you can get over to the far side. Right, okay, so I will ask that man in striped jumper to make his way round to Rebecca, and then we'll take a question from the woman in the second row, meantime.
Thank you, locational advantage. Sheila Page, in my past, unfortunately, had a lot of experience with other countries negotiating agreements with the EU. And the one thing one knows is the EU is extremely good at finding new names for these. Each one of these was unique and special and had a new name. So I think that to talk about the single European market or common market is absurd. It will not be called that. But my question is really, what plans is the shadow cabinet making, or when it is a cabinet, to have the departmental meetings with its European equivalents on the same regular basis that we had when we were members? I mean, they would have to be informal in the first instance, but there's no reason why each of you cannot go across regularly to Brussels for a chat.
Brilliant, thank you. And then...
Yeah, I think the elephant in the room is the fact that pretty much everyone thinks that we should probably be closer to the EU. So what's Labour's actual strategy to make us get closer to the EU? But also, are we going to do show and tell? Because The biggest mistake we've ever made as a Labour movement, and also I think the EU have, is actually celebrating what's great about being in Europe. And I think that if the Labour government do come through and they want to have closer alignment with Europe, we need to actually celebrate that and actually look at things that are positive, not just look at trade, but looking at like cohesion, how we actually make sure that we build a society around the European values that we have. So I think that's probably more important, and then you can actually get full buy-in, because either which way, we're probably going to join Europe again in the medium to long term. Probably not in the next 10 years, but we will do it because it's strategically the best thing for us to do. So Labour needs to start celebrating Europe a bit more and actually speak with confidence. It's a Tory manufactured idea, Brexit, not a Labour manufactured idea, and we need to be celebrating what is good about Europe.
Great, thank you. And then we'll go for man in black at the back. If you just sort of meet Rebecca in the middle.
Cheers, thank you. Sean Hannigan, English Labour Network. Just to kind of echo what our friends in the Irish Society were saying, just to clarify, I remember, Hilary, your predecessor, Peter Kyle, said at a previous event, a conference to do with reforming the Good Friday Agreement. He mentioned to do with changing some of the clauses within it to do with who power would pass to within nationalist and unionist communities, representatives within the Assembly. Is it still Labour policy to, for example, change that so that if the DUP or even Sinn Féin do not want to take up posts, they can't just throw the metaphor out of the bathwater?
Great, thank you. So, Anand, there was questions about the sort of structure of cooperation and about how it was to Labour, but people in Britain talk about Europe.
On the structure of relations with the European Union, it's worth bearing in mind that whatever we want, the EU will impose limits on this. I mean, one of the things you hear very, very frequently from Brussels now is that our embassy there struggles to get face time with the European Commission, because that's how third countries are treated. You don't get regular meetings in the same way unless you've got some sort of deal that makes provision for it. And, you know, as has been mentioned earlier, the European Commission's in-tray is very full of a load of things that have nothing to do with us. So it'll be a struggle, I think, to institutionalise that relationship at a European Union level. I think the other thing to look at is how we deepen our ties with individual member states. One of the many paradoxes of Brexit is, I think, leaving the European Union means that the Foreign Office will have to spend far, far more resources on relations with Europeans, because it's far harder to figure out what's happening when you're not in the room than it is when you are in the room, and that's something that hasn't happened yet. On how we talk about, I mean, the first thing is I hate the phrase European values. I mean, it has all the wrong connotations for me. I mean, not least in the way it's been embraced by the European People's Party now to mean something quite nasty. I think it would be paradoxical if we started to talk positively about the European Union now, when we failed so fantastically to talk positively about the European Union when we were in. And actually, I don't know. I mean, one of the problems with our EU membership was we were transactionalist in a way no other member state was. We joined the European Union because we saw it as an economic project that would make us more prosperous. Every other member state has got a political narrative. We never did. But I can't help thinking that ultimately, if we're to move more close to the European Union, it will be a transactionalist argument that does it as well, rather than a values-based one, because that's just how we think about that relationship, rightly or wrongly.
Anya, could you respond to the same couple of questions from the EU side?
Yeah, actually, and I'm hoping to disagree a little bit as an outsider, and it's always good to disagree in the panel, right? Because when a panel agrees, it's... I think, actually, the Labour Party has instinctive legacy of pro-European policies, because if you look at the Labour Party leadership over the EU presidency, if you look at the several colleagues who are seated here in the room who made to be the members of the European Parliament, they have been incredibly strong in terms of bringing progressive policies forward and leaving incredible legacy inside of the European Union. So I would not per se agree from being an outsider here with a statement that Labour needs to retrieve its pro-European approach, because I mean, standing on the other side, I mean, Labour had a very specific approach, but do show me a social democratic party in Europe that is not somehow bound to the national circumstances. I mean, it's a different discussion we could have about challenging different views or imaginations about the European Union, which had been fueled, of course, by the discussion, take back control and, be sovereign by sitting by yourself. That's a different kind of a discussion. But I think in terms of the pro-Europeanism, the fight for climate change, the questions of trade, the sort of especially development policies, it was the Labour politicians who have been champions of that inside of the European Union. And honestly speaking, we know that you can't come back quickly, but we miss you in that sense of the leadership. So here I would a little bit argue that from the other perspective, it may have been perceived in a bit of a different way, and also pay the tribute to all of the colleagues who have been engaged in the European politics, because it's not so black and white.
Anya, Hilary, Anya's just touched on the sort of the content of European policy, like some of the brilliant social and environmental progress that Europe has brought. And of course, we're not part of that process now. In the summer, Keir said we wouldn't diverge just for its own sake. So should we be aligning ourselves voluntarily to some of the good new social and environmental policy that Europe is embracing?
I'll come to that. Just to answer the colleague over there. Look, Labour's policy is to work with all parties and all communities in Northern Ireland to try and make devolved government work, but you have to win consent to be able to do that. And that is just a plain fact. And I'm very much in favour of people meeting and having a chat and a conversation. I really am, because, from Parliament's point of view, there used to be a constant flow of parliamentarians, ministers coming in, and a lot of that has dried up. I served for a couple of years on the EU-UK Parliamentary Partnership Assembly, which is the one structure there is for a continuing conversation, and I think it's very important. Look, on alignment, in many respects, we haven't diverged yet. The thing about, the Brexiteer argument, we need to leave so we are free to forge our own path. Look at what's actually happened. So, government comes along, current government, and says, right, we're going to not have the terrible EU REACH system, we're going to have a British REACH system. That is chemicals regulation. And the British chemicals industry says, what? That's going to cost us, well, I think they came before the Select Committee. It was something like, it was 1 billion, and now they're saying it's 2 billion, or, very large sums of money to be in exactly the same position. Can you just explain to me again why it's to our benefit? Or the UK CA mark. You turn over lots of products, and on the bottom it says CE mark, which is the, conformity assessment and so on. And the government said, no, we're going to have a CA mark. Well, they've postponed that. I'm not sure it's quite as many times as not introducing the checks on the border. They've postponed that as well, because they're coming face to face with the reality, what is in our interests. And thirdly, any business in the United Kingdom that is exporting goods to the EU, if the EU changes the specifications or the rules of the single market, they're going to change to match that. Otherwise, they can't sell their products in the European Union. So there is a great pressure and interest, a pragmatic interest, in the direction of alignment. Now, there may be areas where we think it is so fundamental it's in our interest to diverge, but Keir was absolutely right to say we should work on the basis that we will seek to align, because that is going to make any subsequent negotiations easier than if we've wandered off and done lots of other things differently. On the final point about how we talk about Europe, the history, Annan is right, we stood on the other side of the garden fence, coal and steel community, common market. We peered over, and eventually we said, can we join? And the first answer we got was no, and the second answer we got a few years later was oui. And it was a pragmatic decision. And I think our relationship is going to continue to be a pragmatic one. And as the public comes face to face with the practical consequences, why is it difficult for British artists to go and perform in Europe when the arts, creative industries, sound engineers, actors, this is one of our fabulous I hate the word export industry, but it is. We're brilliant at this stuff. absolutely brilliant. And yet we've made it more difficult for our performers to go and do that. So we say to the EU, can't we make it easier for ours and easier for yours to come back? And everyone says, well, that sounds jolly sensible to me. And that's why I said in answer to the earlier question, bit by bit, step by step. And that, it seems to me, is how public opinion itself will move over time as it is faced with all of these individual questions and says to itself, well, what is the sensible way of trying to make things better?
Last round of questions. So I'm not going to be able to get to everyone, but go to women in the second row. I'll go to man standing at the back. And women in the third row. Yeah, go ahead.
Katrina Munro. They've all been very interesting comments, but I'd like to pick up on this point about alignment. So I totally agree that, of course, we shouldn't deliberately misalign ourselves simply on a point of principle. But coming back to the point that was made earlier about the democratic deficit if we were to join the EEA or the Single Market and Customs Union, do we not encounter that anyway? It's simply a consequence of having left the European Union that we lack the democratic accountability that we previously had. And ultimately, in my view, my very strongly held view, I hope that we will rejoin the European Union before I die.
And meanwhile, if the man with the purple shirt comes round to ask his question. Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm from Faversham in East Kent, and I just want to start by saying the impact of Brexit on East Kent, where we have Operation Stack and miles of lorries. And there is an issue about us being too tolerant of this thing. You know, we should be complaining, but that's my observation. My question is for the Labour Party, and I've raised this before, the Labour Party's policy on Northern Ireland is to support the union. Now, I think our Labour Party's position should be to support the Good Friday Agreement, because recently there was these census, I think, in Northern Ireland indicated a slight majority supporting nationalists. So, you know, in the future, if that continues, then the Labour Party may find itself in a very difficult position.
Thank you.
We should be supporting the Good Friday Agreement.
Great, thank you very much. And then the final question, so there.
Hi, good morning. My name is Tiago. I'm Portuguese and Oxford City Council for Labour. My question is very simple. I believe the next one or two generations, the public in UK will want to rejoin again the European Union. My question is, do you think the European Union will receive with open arms UK, or they will do some checks to verify if the UK don't want again want a Brexit after 40 years? Thank you very much.
It's a lovely question. My view on that is, while one of our major political parties is opposed forever to Europe, they would never have us back. You know, it's about the Conservatives and how they evolve over time. That's a depressing thought for you all. Let me ask Anya to respond to those questions and your closing remark.
Thank you very much. I just want to make one short, because I am bound to leave all those who ask phenomenal questions unsatisfied, because there were so many of them. So I just want to come to one that has been a sort of a common thread, which was about democracy and democratic malaise. I think, you know, Brexit has been sort of named as part of democracy, lack of legitimacy. But I think that we have to reflect very strongly about how we empower people and how we make our democracies work. And I think that this is not only a question towards the European Union and empowerment through the whichever sort of a format we have or the decision-making process, but we have to make democracy work from the local level to the global level as such. And here I think, this what Sadiq Khan said earlier in his opening speech, people do fear what's happening with the world. I mean, people are using the words like polycrisis, which brings disempowerment, and people feel that they can hardly influence the future, let alone think about the prospect for themselves, for the previous and future generations, so to say. So if we are to empower people, we need to think about not only the socio-economic construct, international construct, but also the way people can define the way they want the world to move forward. And I think the discussion about the prospects of the EU, and I hope the discussion about the future of the European Union will learn from the conference. Now it's very forgotten, but I'm a bureaucrat, so please forgive me, Conference on the Future of Europe, and everything else that happened in the elections, the changes we have when it comes to political forces, and the things that are inadmissible. Because what we see as the anti-democratic tendencies, and we will hear later on from Poland that hopefully is making the breakthrough, is inadmissible, it's dangerous, and I think Tony Judd warned us a lot 5 years or 10 years ago, saying let's not be the next generation of the sleepwalkers.
And then last remarks for you.
Yeah, just very quickly, the point on alignment was absolutely spot on, that EEA is more pernicious democratically than membership was, because any form of alignment when we're outside, we don't get a vote. One of the big differences about being inside was we did get a vote, but we need to make that decision about whether we're willing to take steps towards dynamic alignment. There's a big difference between voluntary alignment that Hillary was talking about, we will keep up with EU laws because we've chosen to, and dynamic alignment, which binds you to doing it. It's only dynamic alignment that gets you improved access to the single market. So there are complicated trade-offs that we don't really discuss enough, I don't think. On the economic benefits, I mean, I disagree slightly with Hillary here, because I think I'm not sure it's the case that over time the economic impacts of Brexit become clearer. One of the things we've seen with the war in Ukraine and the cost of living crisis is a lot of voters blame Brexit for things Brexit isn't responsible for. And one of the things we've seen at the moment is because the economy isn't doing particularly well, opinion has turned quite strongly against Brexit. One of the interesting things for the future will be, imagine our economy starts performing better. It is at least possible that those same voters say, well, Brexit's working now. It's a spurious argument, but actually that link between economic outcomes and public understanding is quite an interesting and complicated one. So I wouldn't necessarily hold my breath that people are going to always think this is the bad stuff Brexit, the good stuff isn't. Finally, on will the EU accept us back? The EU's got a very difficult decade or two ahead of itself when it comes to enlargement. It's dealing with the Western Balkans and Serbia that's increasingly turning towards Russia, and of course it's made a lot of rhetorical promises to Ukraine. Under those circumstances, the fear, if you think, which I don't, that we're going to be in a position to be thinking about rejoining any time in the next couple of decades, is that we get caught in a queue. And it's a queue that will become very political. It's a queue that involves referendums in some member states. Enlargement, I think, is going to become a really poisonous issue inside the European Union in the years to come. And just on Labour and Europe, I was going to say when, if they form the next government, I think it's incredibly difficult because dealing with Europe includes very, very hard-fought negotiations for long-term minimal economic gain. And our politics is very, very bad at doing things like that. So my suspicion is that a Labour first term will see far less progress on substance rather than style when it comes to the EU than many people seem to think.
Anna, thank you very much. And Hillary, last thoughts to you.
Well, just to answer the point about the Good Friday Agreement, Labour stands foursquare behind the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, we negotiated it. I mean, it's the first kind of article of faith and policy of anyone who is the Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. And it's very clear about, if you were alluding to a border poll, now my own view, Keir's view is I think that is a long way off, but it's very, very clear about the circumstances in which that happens. And it says that the Secretary of State must call a border poll when he or she thinks that a majority of people in Northern Ireland are likely to vote in favour of a united Ireland. Well, there's no indication at all at the moment that that is the case. And secondly, the people who decide are the people of Northern Ireland and the people of the Republic, because the general expectation is there would also be a referendum then. They decide in those circumstances whether they want to bring about a change. But that is quite some way away. the issue for today, as we've discussed, is getting the politics working. Government is difficult, whatever you're talking about. Government is difficult. And, you know, there are, I haven't quite met people who've said, oh, we should just go back in, as if the EU will, to answer the question, say, Britain, welcome. Now, where do we leave your rebate? I think I've got it in a cupboard somewhere. Schengen, don't worry about that. You don't have to join. That is not what it's about. It is about the step-by-step building of a better relationship, given the decision that was made by the British people, which I profoundly regret. I think Brexit was a very bad idea, and I haven't changed my mind. But it happened. And as I said in my opening remarks, you have to deal with the world as it is, as you seek to change it into the world you would wish it to be. And much will depend not only on politics here, but the future politics of the European Union. And I think enlargement's a really interesting question, because, of course, the EU has said repeatedly, free movement, for example, is one of the 4 freedoms, and there's no moving on that. When I was feeling impish, I would say sometimes to European colleagues, now supposing Turkey became a perfect democracy tomorrow and met all of the dossiers required for EU membership, would the EU vote to admit Turkey on the basis of freedom of movement? And you got some very, very interesting answers, because, and the honest ones would say, well, there's no chance of that happening at all. So, it demonstrates the European Union has choices about its future development, and as do we. And what we're seeking now, if we can win the election, is to have the chance to serve and to address those difficulties. And I look forward to working with you if we're successful in doing precisely that. And can I thank all of you for coming along here today, because it's a packed room.
Yeah.
So it's the subject of the moment, is it not?
It certainly is, certainly for the Fabian Society. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to my 3 brilliant panellists, and particularly thank you to those of you who are standing. And let's move on to the next session.